Public policy. Again, public policy is really any action taken by our government on an issue that affects American citizens. And again, we're talking about the federal or state or local. So this video talk is more about the local and the state rather than the federal government. But all three levels of your government, the federal government, the state, and the local, have a role in shaping public policy. But for this talk, we're going to zoom in more on the local and the state level. But you've seen this slide if you've watched the national public policy or the federal government's role in public policy. But just remind yourself that public policy is government action to tackle a problem of society. And of course, the voters, citizens, get to decide what matters. They vote for people who will then tackle these problems. So apparently at some point, voters in America thought that kids in school need to be provided lunch, now maybe even breakfast. And at some point, people in America thought that we need to protect certain types of animals because if we don't, we won't have them. So the black-footed ferret, for example, is protected. So voters, citizens decide when they vote for people what will be important, and that shapes the public policy. Remember, federalism states, this idea of federalism states that we will have a national government, a state government, and local government, and that some duties and responsibilities are shared between all three of those. We mentioned taxes. For example, the federal government can tax you, so can the state, so can the local. But then some are very distinct. You can't have a city having a military. Right? It's only the federal government and to some extent the state with the National Guard and the Air National Guard. The federal government is not involved in giving you a hunting license or deciding whether or not you can be a teacher. That's the state. So there are distinct roles for each level of our government. But for this talk, in this video, we're going to talk more about the state and local role in creating public policy. So whatever state you might grow up and land in as an adult and live in, there will be public policy there shaped by the voters and the citizens of that state. And within that state, a city or a municipality or a county will be also setting public policy. But for this talk, we'll just use Ohio as an example. So public policy at the state and local level in Ohio can range in a huge issue, a variety of issues. And again, the federal government would have some say in public policy on all of these, but so does the state. For example, public education primarily falls on the states. I mean, the federal government does have some say. It has a Department of Education, a Secretary of Education, but generally public education falls on the state, and creating public policy for education in Ohio might be different than in the state of Florida or in the state of Wyoming. So every state is free to do public education their own way as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution or any federal law. But you see on the screen all kinds of issues that the public in Ohio and frankly in any state is involved with. They care about vaccines and clean water and law enforcement, maybe opioid addiction. I mean, these are things that just came to my head. Businesses and employment, how we're going to keep people employed and having a job. These are all public policy issues, and there are thousands. I mean, any issue you can think of, there's probably already people who've thought of it, and there's probably already a public policy in place dealing with a problem of society or a state, so the society within that state. So just to kind of keep this clear in your head, Generally, in the state of Ohio, the General Assembly makes the laws that create Ohio public policy. But we could say this for any state. If we were to go to Kentucky, the General Assembly, the lawmaking body of Kentucky, or Utah, they make the laws that create the public policy for those states. Or they give the power to executive agencies to create the public policy on some issues. So, for example, in Ohio, the General Assembly may grant the executive agencies or the head of the executive branch of our government, which would be the governor, the power to come up with public policies or to enforce their public policies that they've already passed. The governor in Ohio, or the people who work for the governor, can enforce the laws. They create their own public policies in some cases through executive orders. So the governor, if we think about some of the things that have been going on recently, maybe with COVID-19, the governor had power to issue executive orders on health, but also the General Assembly got involved and maybe over the last year or so kind of reined in the governor's power a little bit without having to check in. So now the governor has to check in with the General Assembly and maybe get their approval on certain things. And the General Assembly passed laws and that created public policies that now limited the governor to what he can do. But this is the kind of dance that goes on between the executive branch and the legislative branch. It happens all the time in every state. But generally speaking, the legislative branch, the General Assembly, would make the public policy, and it generally falls on the executive to enforce that public policy. But again, the executive can do executive orders. He has some power, or she has some power to act. So if we looked at this chart of Ohio's government, obviously the people of Ohio vote. Right? They are the ones who vote on representatives and senators to go to Columbus to make the laws. So most state public policy is created with the legislative branch. But most enforcement of that public policy falls to the governor or the governor's cabinet. It's very similar to the federal level, whereas Congress creates the public policy and it falls on the president or the president's cabinet to enforce it. Nationally, well, in the state of Ohio, it falls on the governor to enforce public policy that's been passed by the legislative branch or Congress. So the cabinet is involved in the enforcement, and the governor has a team of people that heads heads state agencies that have been appointed by the governor and approved by the Ohio Senate, and they make sure that public policy is carried out. And again, the biggest example would be, for example, Ohio's health director. This person works for the governor, but this person makes sure that there's vaccines, if there's a health issue, as we've been living through recently, and making sure that there's a plan. But ultimately, that person would report to the governor. So the governor is responsible for enforcing the public policy of the General Assembly. And in the absence of anything passed by the General Assembly, then the governor would make those policies. This is the cabinet room at the State House where the governor's cabinet would meet and discuss policy issues in the state. But also beneath that, we have municipalities, which are cities, counties, and public schools that also make policies. So generally speaking, cities and counties, an elected body would then create the policy. So whether we're talking about county commissioners or township trustees or city councils, if we're talking Dublin, the City Council of Dublin or the school board in Dublin would create a policy, right? So we have school board policy, but then it falls on the executives to enforce that policy. So the superintendent or the mayor or a county administrator that would be hired by the county commissioners. The elected body would create the policy, and then the executive, whether that executive is voted on, like in the form of a mayor, or hired in the form of a city manager or administrator, or in the form of a superintendent, they are the ones responsible for enforcing that policy. So primarily what you've had interaction with as maybe a high school student is you've worked or lived under board policy, school board policy. And that policy is passed by the school board, and it is public policy, right? Because school board is a independent local government, and then enforced by the superintendent who they hire to be their executive. But think of every issue that you can think of, like you name it, whether we're talking about protecting fish or drug abuse or immigration, illegal immigration, whatever, it is part of public policy. So there exists on the federal level, there's federal public policy, but there's state and local as well. And so every state in the union can kind of do their own thing and will do their own thing based on what the voters and citizens of those states want, what they see as important. If, for example, West Virginia is really dealing with an opioid issue, that might be the number one public policy issue in West Virginia. Whereas people in Arizona might see their number one public policy issue is maybe illegal immigration. It just depends on where you're at in the country, where the citizens of that country are. Sometimes it's related to physical location. Obviously, people living in Maine might have different public policy issues. If maybe it might center around fishing or hunting or tourism or whatever drives Maine's economy and the workers of Maine, that would be very different than, say, the people of state of Tennessee, which is got other issues and other things that drive the economy and create public policy in Tennessee. So it really depends on where you're at and what the people of those states want and the problems of those states. There are some problems that exist in every state. There are some that exist only in that state, maybe. And then maybe there's some where it's a little heavier in that state. Opioid abuse is probably everywhere, but there are certain states that it has hit hardest. The same thing with every public policy, right? Probably, protecting the bald eagle might be an every state issue, although you're probably not going to find a lot of bald eagles in New Mexico. It's maybe not their natural habitat. So it's varied, and the point is, you as a citizen of America and as a citizen of Ohio and within a town in Ohio, Dublin or wherever, you can think of issues, public policy issues that are being addressed by your government or that you feel might need to be addressed. The point is, it's called public policy because it involves the public, and you are a member of the public. And soon, if you haven't already voted, you'll be voting soon. You'll be a member of the voting public, a citizen that can get involved. And none of these issues that I've talked about or that come to your mind exist without people's input. And you're a person, you're a citizen. So don't be afraid to get involved on something that matters to you, whether at the state, local, or even the federal level.